My name is John Knapp. I'm president of Hope College, and we are delighted to be a new educational partner for the World Affairs Council of West Michigan. This is the first in an ongoing series of programs that we will host here on our campus as a part of the World Affairs Council's Great Decisions series. We'll be hosting another program of this kind in 2 weeks from this morning at the same time, on the topic of North Korea. This morning, we are delighted to continue a conversation that we began here at Hope College just last Thursday on the larger issues surrounding turmoil in the Middle East. We actually held our Critical Issues Symposium last week, a day that we actually closed down the college and canceled classes so that we can focus together as a campus community on critical issues of our time. And as we discussed the Middle East, certainly one of the issues that is embedded within that larger topic is the fate of the Kurdish people. And we're delighted this morning to have with us Dr. Jessie Clark. Dr. Clark is a geographer and a member of the faculty at the University of Nevada, Reno. For the last decade, she has conducted research in southeast Turkey with a particular emphasis on the Kurdish people in Turkey, in the autonomous Kurdistan region of Iraq, and on the surrounding area that we sometimes think of as Greater Kurdistan, where the Kurdish people live in that region of the world. Her scholarship is focused on narratives of national belonging and how these shape family and community relationships, especially as they have implications for Kurdish women. Dr. Clark is a graduate of the University of Oregon. She earned her master's degree and her PhD at the University of Arizona. Please join me in welcoming Jessie Clark.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you here at Hope for welcoming me and hosting me on my first visit to Michigan. I've never been to Michigan before, and I've had a really wonderful couple of days. And I hope to have a little time before I have to jet off this afternoon to see a little bit more of Holland and enjoy this snowstorm we're in. And I want to thank just a couple of people who have helped facilitate my visit here. So Derek Emerson for the lovely walkover this morning, and then President Knapp, thank you so much for hosting me here, and I look forward to more conversations afterwards. So, and of course the World Affairs Council, who has been the organization that brought me over. And I just want to say it's especially rewarding for me to talk to students, and I have to tell you that before I get started, that all of the work I've done in Turkey actually began with a study abroad program that I participated in when I was an undergraduate at University of Oregon. And so it just goes to show you that, whatever experience that may be, hopefully you have some sort of moment here as a student that just kind of sparks a future direction, and being a student is a great experience, and I miss college a lot, I have to say. So, all right, so I was asked to come and talk to you all and to talk to the World Affairs Council in Grand Rapids about our allies in the Middle East, because in part my expertise is in Turkey. So I'll begin with a question. How many of you consider Turkey to be an ally to the United States? Okay, I'll follow that up with, how many of you consider the Kurds to be an ally to the United States? Okay. Can it be both? In 2016, in Turkey, it's not looking like that. It turns out that the long 100-year history of the Kurds in this region makes that question very hard to answer. The Kurds are our allies in the fight against ISIS. They were our allies in the First and Second Gulf Wars. They are historically important allies to the United States. Turkey is also an ally. Turkey is a fellow member of NATO, an EU candidate, and has been called the best example of a moderate Muslim state in the Middle East and a stabilizing force. The problem is that Turkey is currently at war with a segment of its Kurdish population in cities across southeast Turkey. And it has recently started a military campaign against Syrian Kurds to the south of its border, who, along with their Turkish and Iraqi counterparts, are the United States boots on the ground fighting ISIS. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a conflict unfolding in Turkey, this conflict. Why? Because I've spent 10 years working in the southeast Turkish region, the Kurdish region of Turkey, and so this conflict is personal to me, but it's also personal to you because it has ramifications. This conflict has ramifications and consequences for the United States' fight against ISIS and for its simultaneous but conflicting allied relationships with the Turks and Kurds. So as any good geographer, I'll start off with a map to set the scene. So this is a map of the Kurdish regions published in the Wall Street Journal over the summer. The salmon color depicts Kurdish inhabited areas. There are approximately 28 million Kurds in this region. The largest population is housed in Turkey, with 12 to 15 million Kurds. So that's approximately 20% of the population. There are 6 million Kurds in Iran, 5 to 6 million Kurds in Iraq, and approximately 2 million Kurds in Syria. Kurds have lived in this region since the early 2nd millennium BCE. It's a mountainous region, so the Kurdish population pivots around the Zagros mountain range, and so the Zagros mountain range extends from about right here along the Iraqi-Turkish border down through this border area here at the Iran-Iraqi border. And so for this reason, the mountains have always been very symbolic for the Kurds, so you'll hear things like the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. They are a self-defined ethnic group with language as a defining feature, and approximately 2/3 to 3/4 of the population of the Kurds are Sunni Muslim. These pink areas also indicate roughly what was once going to be a sovereign and independent Kurdish state, Kurdistan. So something about like that. You'll notice that there is no border around this region today. The closest thing we see to a bordered Kurdistan is the autonomous zone in northern Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, right here. When the Middle East was partitioned at the end of World War I, through a series of treaties between allied and regional leaders, a proposed Kurdish state was very much on the table in the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres. And then it wasn't, annulled and replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 that secured the borders as they are today, as you see them on this map. That was Kurdistan. Today it's not. As a result, Kurds have different political histories and experiences depending on where they are located. They are citizens of 4 different countries: Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. And while I say citizens to denote state belonging, in all of these cases, Kurds have been treated as second-rate citizens through the 20th and 21st centuries. In some cases in Syria, not even as citizens. In addition to shared language and geography, there is a common experience of political oppression across borders that unites the Kurds today and defines the Kurdish experience today. So the region that we'll be talking about this morning is northern Syria and southeastern Turkey. But hopefully we'll have enough time at the end for some questions about some of the other regions in this Kurdish area. But I want to focus on this region. I want to focus on this region because there are some very important events unfolding here that matter to the US in its fight against ISIS, its future relationship with both its Turkish and Kurdish allies, prospects for long-term stability in the Middle East, and of course, the future of Kurdistan. Currently, in Kurdish cities across the southeast region, Turkey is engaged in war with the PKK, an armed nationalist group fighting for rights and recognition in Turkey since the early 1980s. This, in spite of the fact that up until July 2015, Turkey and the PKK were in the middle of a 2.5-year peace process. And there was a real sense of hope among both Turks and Kurds about the future of Turkish-Kurdish political relations and the prospects for peace. In fact, the map I just showed you was published in the Wall Street Journal in June 2015, with this accompanying photo and an article that spoke quite optimistically about the state of the Kurds, that double entendre referring both to status and prospects for independence. Indeed, there have been some hopeful developments in the Kurdish regions towards increased independence. Iraqi Kurdistan today holds significant autonomy since the first Gulf War. Out of the power vacuum created by the Syrian civil war, Syrian Kurds have established self-government in parts of northern Syria, and a pro-Kurdish party in Turkey has made significant gains for Kurdish representation in the Turkish general elections at the time this story was written. And so this is, in fact, an image that depicts pro-Kurdish party supporters around the time of the Turkish general elections in June 2015, celebrating the historic gains and victory of the HDP, the pro-Kurdish political party in Turkey. In Turkey, when the current ruling party, the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, came into power in 2002, they extended a number of reconciliatory efforts towards the Kurds in the form of political, social, and economic initiatives. The pro-Kurdish government, the pro-Kurdish party, also spearheaded a number of development efforts at the city level. So for the most part, the last decade has been pretty promising for Turkish-Kurdish relations. And, of course, the PKK and AKP began a peace process in 2012. Unfortunately, that window for peace was slammed shut this summer. Since July, the southeast Turkish region has devolved into conflict once again, as the PKK has taken up arms against the Turkish state, with an affiliated youth movement declaring certain urban neighborhoods autonomous. So what happened? I want to shed light on the reasons Turkey is fighting its Kurds internally. And to do so, I'd like to complicate our idea of the Kurds. Do we know who we're talking about? And what's actually gone on in this region beyond the major headlines? So let's zoom into the southeast Turkish region, this predominantly Kurdish region of Turkey. Since Turkish independence in 1923, the Kurds have had limited to no minority rights, as their identity was subsumed, at least officially, into a Turkish one. So when describing the first decade of reforms, in which a series of restrictions on Kurdish expression were implemented, my research collaborator, who's a Kurd, said to me, "Jessie, can you imagine one day a whole population woke up and no longer existed?" And for many Kurds in Turkey, and I think throughout the region at this time when those borders were drawn in 1923, this was the reality. Through a process in Turkey, through a process of Turkification, Kurdish expression of any kind, language, dress, naming rights, was illegalized, made illegal. So what do you do when someone tells you you don't exist? You probably fight. Indeed, there have been over 36 identifiable Kurdish rebellions throughout the 20th century in Turkey. When I first went to Turkey in 2003, this region was fresh out of a bitter and violent 15-year period of sustained fighting between the PKK, led by its founder Abdullah Öcalan, now in prison, and Turkish security forces, in which 40,000 people were killed, approximately, thousands of villages burned, and millions of people displaced, and the estimates are 1 to 4 million, depending on the source. And it's also important, a couple things to note here, the PKK has been declared a terrorist group by the Turkish state, but also by the United States. And it's also important to note that during this period of conflict, both Turks and Kurds suffered a great deal. So it's important to remember kind of both sides of suffering that happened, or both experiences of suffering that happened. At that time, and still today, much of the urban southeast looked like this. So you had a combination of established housing and infrastructure here, alongside squatter settlements, or gecekondu in Turkish, built to accommodate the thousands of families fleeing rural violence. After a ceasefire between the PKK and Turkish state in 1999, and the election into office of the AKP, led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan in 2002, Turkish policy in the region shifted pretty dramatically. The government initiated, or resurrected in some cases, a number of economic and social development initiatives. For example, some of you may have heard of the Southeast Anatolian Project, the GAP Project, which was began as a hydroelectric venture in the 1970s, but expanded in the 2000s, that outlined the construction of a series of dams along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as a means to harness water to irrigate, mechanize, and essentially modernize agriculture in this region in order to boost the regional economy. In addition, there were also social programs implemented specifically in the cities, such as women's education and empowerment centers in urban neighborhoods, primarily poor and migrant neighborhoods. So these are a couple images of some centers in some of the neighborhoods, and I actually did a lot of my research working in these centers. A pro-Kurdish political party established in the 1990s with a clear platform to spearhead the advancement of Kurdish rights was elected into city governments in Southeast Turkey in 1999 and has also spearheaded similar initiatives in the urban areas, sometimes in collaboration with the Turkish state. So on the left here is actually a center sponsored by the local pro-Kurdish government, and then on the right here, a center sponsored by the national Turkish government. There was a lot to be hopeful for when the AKP came into power and the pro-Kurdish government took more control over local government offices. Then, this past summer, in June, Turkey held general elections. Great. For the first time in history, the pro-Kurdish government, the HDP, it's the People's Democratic Party, gained enough votes to pass the minimum threshold of 10% for representation in parliament. It was special for the fact that this was a first for the party, but it was monumental for the fact that this was the first time in Turkish history the Kurds would have an identifiable and distinct and recognized voice in government. So I was in Southeast Turkey at the time, actually. I was in the city of Diyarbakir over this election period, and I remember when the votes were rolling in and the news stations were declaring the numbers, and I think the pro-Kurdish party got about 13% of the vote. And Diyarbakir, the city I was in, just erupted into a big party, the entire city, and lasted till all hours of the morning. And so it just conveys to you the sense of hope and optimism there was after the results of the election came in regarding the successes of the pro-Kurdish political party. And this is actually an image taken from the pro-Kurdish party rally that happened 2 days prior to the election in Diyarbakir. So I think this picture conveys a lot of that sense of hope and optimism people had. The window for peace and recognition had been flung open in a very dramatic fashion. But it was very soon after this moment that window came crashing down. So while the HDP had gained votes in the election, the AKP, the ruling party, lost votes and did not earn enough to remain in single-party rule. This meant a coalition government was in order. Unfortunately, there was a failure to form a coalition government by August, and the AKP called for new elections in November. A number of political analysts have suggested that the AKP intentionally stalled the coalition building process in order to procure a new election and thereby a shot at regaining those lost votes. In November, the second time around, the pro-Kurdish party lost votes, but not enough to move below the threshold. The AKP gained votes, enough to continue in single-party rule. As coalition debates and deliberations continued between June and August, when the runoff election was ultimately called, the peace process ended in July. And Turkey's deep-seated fears of Kurdish separatism and terrorism returned to the table. What happened? I can tell you what happened in Diyarbakir, and will let that city and story stand in for similar processes and experiences across the urban southeast. It's in Diyarbakir that I've conducted most of my research over the last 10 years. Diyarbakir is also an important site on its own. It's a very symbolic city for Kurds, so it's fondly termed the unofficial capital of Kurdistan by a lot of Kurds. It was on the receiving end of hundreds of thousands of displaced families during the 1990s conflict, probably the most of any city in this region. So to give you a sense of how quickly the city grew in 1994, the population increased from around 300,000 to 800,000 people. It's also been a focal point of anxieties between the Kurds and Turkish state. For example, it's the seat of the pro-Kurdish party. At the same time, it's the home of the largest Turkish military base in the region. People often look to Diyarbakir to measure the state of relations between Turks and Kurds. In spite of this recent growth in a political voice for the Kurds in Turkey, efforts towards inclusion, and social and economic developments in the southeast region, Kurds still experience a great deal of disenfranchisement. It can feel sometimes, if you live in this region, as if you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or 1 step forward, or 3 steps back at any given time, where you feel like you're making headway in repairing political relations, gaining ground, earning rights, and then suddenly have it pulled back. So there's this pervasive sense of distrust of the Turkish government that still very much remains in this region. And in fact, this is an image from 2009 in Diyarbakir when police rounded up over 100 pro-Kurdish party members with accusations of terrorist ties, of having connections to the PKK. And there was this image that appeared in the newspapers, this very poignant image of pro-Kurdish party members lined up outside of the courthouse in Diyarbakir with their hands tied with plastic handcuffs. And so in the weeks to follow, billboards like this appeared in the city, in Diyarbakir, that said, so kelepçe is the Turkish word for handcuff, that said, not handcuffs, equality. Not handcuffs, freedom. Not handcuffs, justice. Another billboard, and I don't have an image of that, read, Dün Halepçe, bugün kelepçe. Yesterday Halabja, today handcuffs, referring to the city of Halabja, Iraq, where the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein gassed in 1988 and killed 5,000 people. This was a Kurdish city. This example shows you how different Kurdish movements are, this example shows you of how different Kurdish movements across the region tap into each other symbolically. Things like this mass incarceration of public officials can feel quite commonplace in spite of some of the more positive developments we've seen. I also mentioned that the last decade and a half was a time of great investment in development initiatives as a mechanism for security building and social and economic integration. Much of that development in the cities has looked like this, however. Over the last decade, like cities across Turkey, Diyarbakir has been on the receiving end of billions in federal money towards urban development projects as a mechanism to boost the economy through the construction industry. The AKP claims to have invested $5.4 billion in construction, infrastructure, housing, education, and health programs in Diyarbakir alone. The problem is that very little of this money flows directly to low-income and migrant residents. Unemployment has remained high in the Kurdish southeast at approximately 24.2%, in contrast to 3.5% in northeast Turkey. In Diyarbakir, it hovers around 20%, and a large proportion is poor youth. In addition, the influx of refugees from Syria and Iraq has added cheap and undocumented labor for farming and industrial operations, making competitive an already weak and saturated job market. If you look at the urban structure of Diyarbakir today, you very easily see a story of economic disparity, expanding luxury complexes and shopping malls to the north, alongside progressively marginalized migrant neighborhoods. So here are a couple images that show you 2 shopping malls that were constructed in recent years in Diyarbakir, some of the luxury condos and houses that have been built to the northern end of the city. And Starbucks got its first Starbucks about 2 years ago. And these changes aren't just happening in Diyarbakir. As I mentioned before, the AKP has pumped a lot of money into construction, and so If you visit Istanbul today, it looks like a very different city, and most likely what you're going to see on the horizon is a series of construction cranes. And there are new apartment complexes popping up, there's new mosques, there's new shopping malls. So the cities across Turkey are changing quite dramatically right now. So here's an image from one of the migrant and low-income neighborhoods I had previously mentioned to you. An image from such a neighborhood where we have seen recent government investment in the form of urban renewal, this kind of other side of urban development. This image shows urban renewal and rehousing projects that have been co-sponsored actually by the national and local governments, so the Turkish national government and the local pro-Kurdish government. And these have resulted in the forcible displacement of residents from these neighborhoods. Propelled by earthquake concerns and failing infrastructure, these projects are not without some justification, yet a financial investment in the built environment unfolds side by side a disinvestment in the people who reside there. Even where the government has not been tearing down buildings, there have been only minor efforts to keep them up. I showed you an image earlier depicting some of the squatter settlements that were created during the 1990s conflict in a process of over-urbanization. And so here are some more images. So neighborhoods where hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people sought refuge in the 90s, spaces that in spite of some investment are plagued by inadequate housing, lack of access to services, and chronic poverty. What have these urban development projects meant for poor Kurds in these disaffected urban spaces? How have they been lived? And I'll let their words tell the story. So I'm about to show you a series of quotes from interviews my research partner and I conducted in 2010, 2012, and 2014 with individuals working in some of the poor migrant neighborhoods and their observations. So this quote is from Yusuf Bey, who is an administrator at one of the local schools in these neighborhoods, and he said, "Here they look at us like stepchildren. They, the local wing of the national government, doesn't know us or enter here. The national education officers do not come here. There are only two state organizations, the school and health clinic. The state does not enter here. They do not want to enter, because here is the city's other face." And on the right, he says, "The city, the municipal government, the pro-Kurdish government, also does not bring good services here. I always thought they were well-intentioned, but I finally came to the conclusion that they neglect this neighborhood and are not well-intentioned." We heard particular concern regarding young people, as seen in this quote from Munise Hanım, an administrator at a women's education center in this neighborhood. Young women are being influenced by television and magazines, things that were not in the village, the images of sexuality and material goods. They are going to office and dagkappe, and they want to own the life they see there, the clothing and makeup, but they don't feel the city is theirs, nor do they feel they are part of the village either. There are psychological problems because of this split life. This leads to bad things: prostitution, drug use, crime, political activity. And there were a number of narratives discussing this split life of youth who had either been born in the village and moved to the city at a very young age, or were born in the city and growing up at the crossroads of two very different kinds of lives and expectations. So that of their more conservative rural parents, and the other of a material culture in the commercial and wealthier districts. These are children who have no memories of rural conflict, and therefore no understanding of the reasons that they're growing up in these ghettos. And then this quote from Elif Hanım: "There are no social spaces here. Youth can't express themselves. Nobody takes care of them, and they are always looked down upon. These youth who feel useless don't have any solution except go to the mountains. Dağlara gidiyorum. Go to the mountains. Join the PKK. Because they are valued by the PKK. Government doesn't invest in youth there. And the PKK has its bases housed in the Kondo mountain range right south of the Turkish border in Iraq. And so going to the mountains means going to fight for the PKK. So moving back to the built landscape then, these are some of the images of political graffiti that are not uncommon to see in these poor migrant neighborhoods. And so, for example, some of these images, I mean, as I said, this is quite commonplace to see a lot of these references in the landscape, this kind of political graffiti. So you can see here references to the PKK, and Oppo, and Oppo is the term given to Abdullah Öcalan, who's the founder of the PKK. And over the years that we've worked in these neighborhoods, we've seen a lot of this graffiti grow, but also diversify. And so this image here was taken in 2013, and you can see there on the wall it says YDGH. And that's the name of the youth movement that emerged in 2013 that's affiliated with the PKK. And it's that youth movement that is now fighting the Turkish state in these neighborhoods. And that leads us here to this news article from NPR in August. In July, that youth wing of the PKK, the YDGH, took up arms against the Turkish state and began building barricades and digging trenches and declaring neighborhoods autonomous, two of the same neighborhoods I just showed you images of. It was a movement, as I said, that started in 2013 in neighborhoods around the southeast by young people feeling particularly disaffected, according to local residents we interviewed. It intensified in July 2015 in coordination with PKK members who have since moved into the cities to help organize. Turkish security forces responded with heavy military force. So here's some before and after images of the effect of this fighting since July. So on the left, you can see two of the images I just showed you of a neighborhood, as I said, predominantly poor, migrant. And then on the right here, this is actually an image from the very same neighborhood. So these images were taken in 2013 when I was in Diyarbakir. This image here was taken probably about a month and a half or 2 months ago. And this is actually the same street you see right here. And so I don't know if with the lighting you can tell, but there's a mosque back here. You might be able to make it out. That's the very same mosque right there. So there's been a lot of destruction, needless to say, especially in this neighborhood. And unfortunately, this is also the site of a lot of historical heritage sites. And so this is a very important mosque to the Kurdish people. And it's just been nearly destroyed in the fighting. Since July, over 500 people have been killed, and that's a very low estimate that comes from a Human Rights Watch report in December. And 300 to 400,000 people displaced. And those displacement numbers are so high because as a mechanism to deal with this movement, this youth movement, this autonomous movement going on, the Turkish state or the Turkish security forces have declared curfews over a number of neighborhoods that have now been besieged by fighting. And this means that for 24/7, hours on end, people cannot leave their homes. So they can't access food and water. They can't access medical services. Electricity has been cut. So as a result of that, most people have decided to leave their homes. So the numbers are fairly high for that reason. And the neighborhood I just showed you has been on curfew now for 80-something days. I lost track of the count, but it's been a very long time. And it's important to remember that a lot of the populations that have now fled these neighborhoods are the same populations of people that fled their rural homes, fleeing violence in the 1990s. So this is a second wave of displacement happening. So after considering some of these accounts, both from images of the material landscape of the city and the lived voices of residents, it's clear that this current conflict is shaped in part by a combination of uneven urban policy and a lack of economic investment, fueled by the legacies of past war and embodied in an increasingly marginalized youth. I want to read you an excerpt from a New York Times op-ed by Abdullah Demirbaş, who's the former mayor of the district where much of the fighting is taking place in Diyarbakir. And he says, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said recently that military operations in the besieged Kurdish towns would continue until they were cleansed of terrorists. You will be annihilated in those houses, those buildings, those ditches which you have dug, he threatened. But what peace can be built through destruction? Decades of military policies against the Kurds have shown only that violence begets more violence. Many residents of these towns are poor families who were forced to flee the countryside when the conflict between the Kurds and Turkish state was at its peak in the 1990s. Those who are digging trenches and declaring self-rule in Sur and other cities and towns of southeastern Turkey today are mostly Kurdish youth in their teens and 20s who were born into that earlier era of violence, poverty, and displacement, and grew up in radicalized ghettos. Now a new generation will grow up with the trauma of killing, destruction, and forced migration. Where will they go? What will become of them? And how will an angrier generation of Kurds and Turks find common ground? The truth is that my generation may be the last to reach a peaceful settlement through dialogue. Maybe you saw the stories I just told you in Demirbaş's words. This conflict, in my mind, is as much about class and disaffection as it is about political identity. And this is an important story to tell because I think it allows us to connect to this conflict in a very human way. So we all know this story, a story of a poor and disenfranchised population who have turned to violence to express dissatisfaction with the lack of governmental care and a growing social and economic gap. But this conflict is complex and multifaceted and shaped by events at all temporal and spatial scales. We know that this conflict is rooted in resentments that extend all the way back to 1923, to that Treaty of Lausanne. You can't understand why young people are building barricades in neighborhoods in Diyarbakir without also understanding that. You can't also view this conflict in isolation to what has been happening outside and across Turkey's borders. So for example, ISIS has played a huge role in the provocation of ethno-national tensions in Turkey. It serves an advantage for their mission to divide and conquer. In October 2014, as ISIS vehicles moved across the desert towards the Kurdish city of Kobani, Syria, thousands of Kurds in Diyarbakir and throughout Turkey, Europe, and the United States went to the streets to protest Turkish government inaction just south of its borders. Many also accused the government of secretly supporting ISIS in its fight against the Kurds. Kobani was subsequently reclaimed by the Syrian Kurdish military, the YPG, in January 2015. In June 2015, leading up to the general elections in Turkey, a bomb at a pro-Kurdish party rally killed 4 and injured over 100. The apprehended suspect had ties to ISIS. In July 2015, an ISIS bomb killed 33 young people in Suruç, Turkey, a town just across the border from Kobani, who had gathered at the border to spend 2 days rebuilding Kobani. In October 2015, another ISIS bomb killed 102 at a Turkish-Kurdish peace rally in Ankara. It was the most devastating single attack in Turkish history. So what I didn't tell you when I showed you this image from the pro-Kurdish rally 2 days before the election is that moments after this picture was taken, 2 bombs were detonated. So that event I just told you about, and those were ISIS affiliated. And those killed 4 people and over 100, and wounded over 100. With the advancement of ISIS, Kurds, and not just in Turkey, have felt unprotected and vulnerable. This has been expressed through internal tensions between Turkey and its Kurdish populations, as well as significant efforts to organize counter-assaults both by Syrian and Iraqi Kurds to fight ISIS on their own terms. Syria is an important part of this story. Syrian Kurds have mobilized militarily and politically in the power vacuum of the Syrian civil war. Just south of Turkey's border, Syrian Kurds have formed a kind of self-government called Rojava. It's ruled through a canton system. And out of Rojava, they facilitated operations against ISIS. And it's important to note, actually, again, the connections of different movements across the region. So the PKK fights right alongside the YPG, the Syrian against ISIS. And they both share the same political philosophies. So this is an image taken of some children in Aleppo, Syria, a couple years ago. And so in addition to seeing a flag of the Kurdish colors, yellow, red, and green, you also see a flag here with an image of this man. This is Abdullah Öcalan, the founder of the PKK. So his political philosophies and the movement of the PKK have really shaped the current Syrian Kurdish movement in northern Syria. Turkey, long fearing Kurdish separatism internally, obviously has consternation over the organization of a formidable Syrian Kurdish military response, backed by Kurds from across the region. This is one reason the Turkish government has responded to events in southeast Turkey with such force and begun attacks against Syrian Kurds across the border this month. Many suggest Turkey's biggest enemy is the Kurds, not ISIS. And this brings us back to that initial question: who are our allies? Turkey and Kurds are both allies, but growing tensions between the two, provoked by ISIS, will further complicate an already quite paradoxical US stance towards its Kurdish and Turkish friends. As long as our allies are fighting, prospects for broader stability in the Middle East are dim, and along with that, prospects for a more self-determined and empowered Kurdish population, whether that's through greater rights and liberties within the states that they reside, or through new forms of territorial autonomy. So why does Diyarbakir matter? Why does the neighborhood matter? Because what happens in this region is the result of events at different scales and of different dimensions. Securing the Middle East means attending to both the neighborhood and regional geopolitics, and they're absolutely interconnected. The PKK Turkish state conflict derails efforts to fight the Islamic State, and so it's important to understand this conflict in all its social, economic, and political depths. If the Kurdish question in Turkey continues to be addressed as a problem only of terror and not one of economic disadvantage and political disenfranchisement, among other concerns, Turkish peace will remain an unattainable objective. Violence, as Demirbaş argued, will only deepen the economic divides already in place, both within the city and regionally, and it will foment resentment for years to come among a young population now experiencing war for the first time. So while I can't provide you with a resolution to the Kurdish question or broader conflict in the Middle East, it's quite complex, as you can see. The answer does not just lie in military action against faceless terrorists, but in decision-making that acknowledges the unique political, economic, and social conditions from which violence arises. Gelek spas. Thank you. Thank you in Kurdish. So, should I just field questions? Are there questions? Yeah.
Let me give you a microphone so that people can hear you there.
Thank you. Okay, so this does work. So you mentioned that other than the U.S. just basically saying stop attacking the Kurds from the Turkish perspective, have they done anything else other than just say stop?
Actually, in regards to Turkey attacking its own Kurds internally,
Yes,
actually the U.S. has supported Turkey's fight against the Kurds. So this is where it gets a little bit contradictory, the U.S.'s policy towards the Kurds. So Joe Biden visited Turkey about a month and a half ago, I think, and met with Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu and expressed his support for Turkey's fight against the terrorist organization, the PKK. So you have to remember that the PKK is still listed as a terrorist organization in the United States. And so he expressed his support for Turkey's fight. On the other hand, this is quite contradictory because, as I said before, the PKK is fighting alongside the YPG, the Syrian Kurds, against ISIS. And the U.S. has absolutely supported that fight. So delivering weapons and, military or sort of intelligence information, that sort of thing, right? So this conflict highlights a very contradictory policy that the U.S. has historically had towards Kurdish populations in the Middle East. Yeah.
So, to add another layer of complexity, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the current Syrian refugee crisis in Turkey and how that fits. Are the Syrian refugees Kurds? So do you have Kurdish refugees from within Turkey as well as Syrian refugees, and sort of what makes up that community?
Yeah, so many levels to this. So regarding this particular conflict, we don't know quite yet where a lot of these displaced people are going. I have a friend who, my research collaborator lives in Diyarbakir and has actually visited a couple of the families that we were working with during the period of research when things were okay in these neighborhoods, somewhat. And so those families have found relatives in other parts of the city or friends, and so they're living in, very crowded conditions within the city. So people are trying to find relatives. But we don't really know that full story yet. So yes, the fact that Turkey has been on the receiving end of millions of Syrian refugees, many who are Kurdish, complicates the story quite a bit. And so I think, for example, I think that the Western response has been very limited to this internal conflict, because if we look at, for example, the EU right now has a stake in Turkey being able to take in these refugees and keep them there and prevent them from going on to Europe. And so, the EU has, for example, Angela Merkel has engaged in dialogues with Erdogan about, and has said that we can perhaps promise to begin a dialogue about EU membership, because remember, Turkey is an EU candidate country. And so has used that as kind of a bargaining chip to ensure that Turkey can keep these refugees. And so I think that this refugee situation has actually been probably one of the bigger reasons the international community has not kind of responded to this conflict in the way I think it should. But obviously the U.S. has had a historical allied relationship with Turkey, and that prevents it for the U.S. from kind of saying anything too critical as well. But it's a good question, and the refugee conflict or refugee crisis is shaping a lot of things in Turkey right now. Even in Diyarbakir, there's been a huge influx of migrants, and it's really putting a lot of strain on the city.
Jessie, obviously the EU has rejected Turkish membership within the EU several times before, so much so that Erdogan has now refused to reapply.
Yeah.
So the EU doesn't have much of a negotiating tactic available to itself right now. To answer your question of who are our allies in the Middle East, it is more like Iraqi Kurds are our allies, but the rest, it's a big question mark. That's why the civil war in Syria has dragged on for so long, in a sense, because we don't know whether we are on the side of Turkey. Turkey is willing to support some elements in the civil war.
Right.
It's not willing to support the Kurdish elements in the civil war. So you're also looking at national identity of Turkey. I mean, I hate to be the devil's advocate, especially if the devil is Erdogan, but the issue does beg, as a political scientist, the question of whose national identity are we really concerned about, and can we really rely on the West to take care of Turkey's national identity, especially since the West, in the form of EU, has not been very friendly to Turkey's entry into the EU. But those are, of course, it's a very complicated question. There's lots of neighboring areas and their interests included as well. But what I was most interested in is that you said that your focus was on women.
Yeah.
And so I would like you to spend a little bit of time telling us about what exactly you've done with Kurdish women and where you see their needs being met or not being met in terms
Yeah.
of the absence of governmental intervention in that area.
Yeah. So, I initially went to Southeast Turkey to do research on women and the role of women in development because of this shift from this policy of military intervention in the 1990s to development intervention in the 2000s under the AKP. So looking at development as a way to address some of Turkey's long kind of security concerns in this region, address terrorism. And I was interested in particular in the role of women in that because in the urban centers, the biggest face of development was in the form of women's education and empowerment programs. So, things like, so I participated in programs like literacy classes for women, Turkish literacy classes for women. A number of women only spoke Kurdish. And so there was also a citizenship curriculum that went along with the literacy class as well. So teaching women how to, about the history of the Republic, about their rights as Turkish citizens and this sort of thing. So I was interested in actually how development was serving as a nation building project. And assimilation, absolutely. And on the other hand, as I said, the pro-Kurdish government has implemented their own centers, women's centers and women's support centers in adjacent neighborhoods and have sponsored their Kurdish literacy classes and have also tried to use those points of contact with women in the neighborhood to enfold them into the pro-Kurdish political project, which drawing a lot from the philosophies of, the pro-Kurdish movement has actually drawn a lot from the philosophies of the Marxist and socialist philosophies of the PKK, and so they've been so gender equality is very important to their platform. And so they've made huge efforts to try to incorporate women to be more participatory in the political process. So, taking them to the polls to vote and bringing them to the Women's International Day parade that was sponsored by the pro-Kurdish political party. And so it's interesting, what I found ultimately is that women within these neighborhoods are being kind of used for two very different ethno-nation building projects. And so you have this really intimate geopolitics playing out neighborhood to neighborhood, and primarily based around women's development issues. So that was what I did my research on.
3 questions to help me get a clearer picture.
Sure.
The map shows the northern region of the Kurds. Does that mean there are no non-Kurds there?
No. It's predominantly Kurdish. So let me go back to the map. It's going to vary depending on what you're looking at. But I will tell you, I can't give you percentages. Let's see. So these are predominantly Kurdish regions. So that means the majority of the population is Kurdish.
By what percentage? I mean, just roughly. 2 to 1?
Yeah, no, way more than that. I would say in the southeast region, it's at least 90% probably in Turkey. I will tell you that in the course of my work in Diyarbakir, I met two Turkish people who were living there, who were doing work in some of the development centers I was working in. And beyond that, most of the Turkish population in Diyarbakir is probably affiliated with the military base there. So it's a predominantly Kurdish city, predominantly Kurdish region. So I would say at least 90%, yeah.
My other 2 questions, do the Kurds all share a common language? And secondly, are there strategic or economic advantages in that region of Turkey that the country wants to hold such control?
Yeah, two good questions. So they do share a common language, but within the Kurdish language, there are different language groups. So there's the two major language groups are Sorani and Kurmanji. And Kurmanji is spoken in the north, primarily, so this area, and Sorani is spoken more down here. So that's actually a big, there's a big language divide in Iraqi Kurdistan where you have the population in the north speaking primarily Kurmanji and the population in the south speaking Sorani. And then your second question, yeah, so this is a really important region to Turkey because it is the headwaters of, it holds the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates River. So it has a lot of really important natural resources for the state. And I think natural resources are, a huge factor in this story. And so there's a lot to hold on to here. And also, when the government started that Southeast Anatolian project in the 1970s, and it was delayed because of conflict, and then resurrected in the early 2000s, it was primarily to use that water to, harness that water to help boost the regional economy, and that was the intention. And actually, hopefully, try to, help increase the quality of life of Kurds in that region. So I do think there were some genuine intentions there regarding development in terms of bringing Kurds into the kind of fold of the economy.